The forgotten story of who betrayed the Neanderthals. For 40,000 years, the truth has slept beneath layers of stone and silence. We were taught they vanished, outlasted by time, undone by ice. But what if that's not what happened? What if their extinction wasn't nature's doing, but ours? They weren't savages. They were teachers, guides through the frozen world, who shared their fire, their tools, their wisdom, and in return, they were erased. This is not the story of their end. It's the story of our beginning and the betrayal buried beneath it. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who still believes the past can speak, and subscribe so these forgotten histories keep finding you. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Let's see how far this story travels. Now, take a breath and return with me to the Ice Age, to a world where two kinds of humans stood beneath the same sky and only one walked away. 40,000 years ago, the world was ending in silence. The great ice sheets had descended once more, carving their slow dominion across Europe, grinding forests into dust, turning rivers to glass. Beneath that endless pale sky, a few scattered bands of Neanderthals still held their ground, gathering around the faint warmth of their fires. Each flame was a heartbeat against the cold, each spark a memory of what it meant to endure. The valleys where they lived were shrinking worlds, pockets of shelter surrounded by glaciers that crept forward with the patience of centuries. Mammoths roamed the frozen plains. Reindeer crossed the tundra in solemn migration. The air was thick with snow, heavy and soundless, the kind that swallows every echo. The Neanderthals had seen many winters before, but this one felt different. The animals came later, the nights lasted longer, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Their lives were a rhythm older than memory. At dawn, the hunters traced the frozen rivers, reading the faintest prints pressed into snow. The women tended the fires, preserving embers through the wind's assault. Children gathered shards of flint, learning the sacred geometry of survival. They were masters of their land, shaped by its demands, their bodies powerful, their minds attuned to every subtle change in the air. Yet all around them, something unseen had begun to shift. It wasn't war that threatened them. It wasn't plague or famine alone. It was something quieter, a slow unweaving of the world they knew. The herds grew unpredictable, the forests receded, and the songs that had guided them through generations began to fade from memory. Still, they endured, as they always had. They made tools of bone and stone so precise they could split a hair. They painted walls with ochre and ash, recording dreams that would outlast them. Their art spoke of reverence, of belonging, of a people who never imagined they could be erased. Night after night, the last fires burned in caves along the Pyrenees and the Carpathians. The smoke curled upward, black against the white silence. Somewhere in that darkness, the last Neanderthal looked into the flame and saw not warmth, but warning. The world beyond their shelter had begun to change in ways they could not yet name. And so, beneath the frozen sky, humanity's first great ending unfolded not with thunder, but with breath, slow, invisible, and absolute. The light flickered, the wind deepened, and the last fire of an entire kind struggled against the dark. No one was there to witness its final ember fade, but the earth remembered. It always remembers. Beneath the surface of Europe's ancient soil, the story of the Neanderthals waits in silence. The earth guards it carefully, layer by layer, century by century, until the patient hands of archaeologists uncover what time tried to bury. There are no words, no songs, no chronicles written in ink. Only fragments stone, ash, and the ghosts of firelight. Yet from these fragments, an entire world begins to rise again. A shard of flint, chipped by deliberate hands, lies hidden beneath centuries of loam. Its edges are sharp, its symmetry perfect. When it catches the light, it speaks across 40 millennia. Someone stood here once, with purpose, with understanding. Nearby, a scatter of charcoal marks the remains of a hearth. Within that circle of soot lies the geometry of a family, the architecture of warmth, the rhythm of survival. Each discovery breathes life into what might otherwise seem distant proof that intelligence and creativity once flourished in the shadow of the glaciers. Deep inside limestone caves, archaeologists find more than tools. They find presence. On the walls of places like El Castillo and La Pasiega, red handprints emerge beneath calcite veils of time. Some are small, others broad and strong. These are not marks of ownership or vanity, they are signatures of existence. The Neanderthals pressed their palms against the living rock as if to say, "Remember us." Their pigment was mixed from ochre and iron dust, bound by spit and ash, their art born from the same earth that now hides it. In the caves of France and northern Spain, layers of ash seal the memory of countless winters. Each hearth is a testament to persistence. The patterns repeat: burned bone, cracked stone, the faint shimmer of fat in sediment. These remnants tell us that the Neanderthals did not simply survive. They planned, adapted, and thrived in cycles that spanned thousands of years. Their existence was not an accident of nature. It was a dialogue with it. As modern scientists sift through soil and bone, the picture that emerges is neither primitive nor tragic. It is profoundly human. They find evidence of pigments for body paint, ornaments carved from ivory, and tools so refined that even today they challenge the notion of simplicity. Every layer of discovery becomes a page in a forgotten book, one that begins not with death, but with creation. Each artifact whispers a single truth. They lived fully. They imagined. They built meaning from the cold. And though time has tried to silence them, the stones still echo with their story. The wind that passes through those ancient caves carries not emptiness, but remembrance. What we call extinction, the earth still calls memory. They were born into a world of cold breath and endless twilight, a world where survival itself was an art form. The Neanderthals were not creatures of myth or monsters of stone. They were people, molded by the ice and sharpened by time. Every bone, every tool, every soot-stained hearth tells us that they did not merely endure their world, they mastered it. The Ice Age sculpted their lives with merciless precision. Winters stretched for months without thaw. Forests were sparse, the wind relentless. Yet within this frozen empire, the Neanderthals flourished. Their bodies were built for endurance, wide chests for deep lungs, strong limbs for climbing cliffs and carrying heavy game, hands broad and sure, capable of shaping flint with a surgeon's grace. They walked the tundra wrapped in hides sewn with bone needles, hunted reindeer and mammoth across the snow, and carried their kills home to the flickering safety of firelight. Archaeologists have found their camps in valleys long buried by glaciers. There, among the ashes, lie the remains of hearths tended for generations. They reveal a rhythm of life, food shared, tools repaired, wounds treated. In one site, the bones of an injured hunter show signs of long healing. Someone had cared for him, fed him, protected him until he could walk again. Compassion, not cruelty, was written into their survival. In caves where the wind still hums through stone corridors, archaeologists have uncovered graves' bodies laid carefully in shallow earth, sometimes adorned with animal bones, sometimes with flowers whose pollen remains detectable after 40,000 years. These burials are not accidents. They are acts of remembrance. To bury the dead is to recognize the weight of a life, to feel loss, to understand the boundary between what is and what was. The Neanderthals crossed that threshold of awareness long before history began. They understood their world with a mind both practical and poetic. They shaped bone tools with mathematical precision, built shelters against the cold, and traced symbols on cave walls whose meanings we still cannot decipher. Each mark was a conversation with the land, a declaration that they belonged to it, not above it. For too long, they have been remembered as brutish and simple, shadows in the story of our own ascent. But when we look closer, when we listen beyond the silence of time, a different truth emerges. These were not creatures of darkness, but children of the earth's oldest light beings, who carried the warmth of intelligence through the coldest chapters of human history. They were the first to look into the fire and see not just survival, but something greater, a reflection of themselves. Far to the south, where the winds carried warmth and the rivers still ran free, another kind of human began to stir. They were wanderers, lighter of frame and swifter of step. Their bodies built not for endurance against the cold, but for distance, for exploration. Across endless miles of steppe and mountain, they followed the pull of curiosity, of hunger, of something deeper written into their restless hearts. One day, their paths would cross with those who had ruled the North for hundreds of thousands of years. That meeting would change the story of humanity forever. They came slowly, almost invisibly at first, small bands moving through forests of birch and valleys of mammoth grass, guided by stars and seasons. Their hands carried new tools of stone, long and elegant, carved for precision rather than strength. Their minds held songs and symbols that turned survival into strategy, memory into myth. They were thinkers who painted their stories on cave walls before the echoes had even faded, leaving marks meant not for themselves, but for those who would follow. To the land they entered, they were strangers. To the Neanderthals who watched from the shadows of the pines, they must have seemed fragile, even naive. But there was something different in the way these newcomers moved through the world. They were not just surviving, they were imagining. Every landscape they crossed became a canvas. Every obstacle became an invitation to adapt. They built lighter shelters, traveled farther, communicated through gestures and words that carried meaning across distance. The ice did not frighten them, it challenged them. They learned quickly, borrowing what they could from those who came before. And as they pressed farther north, their presence became more than a migration, it became an unfolding transformation. The quiet reign of the Neanderthals, who had shaped Europe's cold heart for millennia, was about to face something it had never known before. Competition not from nature, but from another kind of mind. Archaeologists find the traces side by side in ancient soil. The old tools of the Neanderthals, heavy and deliberate, lie beside slender blades of the newcomers. Two worlds overlapping for a brief, fragile moment. For tens of thousands of years, the Neanderthals had believed they were alone in their mastery. But now, as new fires burned on distant hillsides and unfamiliar songs echoed through the wind, a question began to rise across the frozen horizon. Who were these wanderers? And what would it mean when two versions of humanity stood face to face at the edge of the world? The Earth remembers the moment when two species of humans stood beneath the same sky. Beneath layers of soil and ash, archaeologists uncover the traces of something extraordinary. Two fires, burning side by side. In those ancient hearths, one finds the broad, sturdy tools of the Neanderthal, shaped by strength and tradition, and beside them, the slender blades of the newcomers, crafted for precision and reach. It is here, in these overlapping layers of flame and flint, that the story of coexistence begins. For a time, the world held two kinds of humanity. In valleys once ruled by the Neanderthals alone, the strangers from the south built their shelters nearby, following the same rivers, hunting the same herds, drinking from the same frozen streams. The land that had once belonged to one now belonged to both. The silence of the Ice Age was broken not by violence, but by curiosity. For the first time, the Neanderthals were not alone. Archaeological evidence paints this moment not as a collision, but as a meeting. The newcomers arrived into a world already tamed by others. The Neanderthals had mastered fire long before, had weathered storms and glaciations that would have killed most life. The new arrivals learned quickly. They observed how to hunt in the snow, how to store meat, how to use bone and sinew to bind tools. In the caves of southwest France, traces of both peoples appear in the same chambers, separated only by inches of sediment, as if one had entered soon after the other. Perhaps they met around the same fires. Perhaps they exchanged glances before words, gestures before trust. The newcomers may have offered ornaments of shell and stone, while the Neanderthals shared their skill of working flint or reading the movement of game. There is evidence of imitation tools once made in one style begin to appear in another, designs merging across cultures. It speaks of contact, not conflict, of a fragile piece held together by necessity. Yet beneath that fragile piece lingered something more profound. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals had been the keepers of Europe's cold heart. Now they faced another species that thought like them, dreamed like them, and yet was subtly different. Both made fire, both shaped tools, both painted with ochre and ash, but one of them carried an insatiable hunger for expansion. For a brief and flickering age, two fires burned in the same world. The night sky above them knew no difference between their smoke, but the wind that carried it did not know that one fire would soon fade, and the other would inherit the earth. In the beginning, the newcomers were students. They entered a world that did not belong to them, a world shaped by ice and silence, where survival was a language already spoken fluently by another kind of human. Every mountain, every frozen valley, every herd that moved across the tundra carried the memory of those who had lived there for generations. To endure the north, the newcomers would need to learn its ancient rhythm, and the Neanderthals were its masters. Archaeological traces reveal this exchange written not in words, but in craft. The newcomers' tools began to change. The thick, heavy blades of the Neanderthal toolkit gave way to more efficient forms, inspired by the wisdom of the cold. Flint was struck in new ways, yielding edges that stayed sharper, longer. Spears became sturdier, shaped for thrusting at close range rather than throwing from afar. They learned to stalk their prey in silence, to read the faintest impressions in snow, to track by the subtle bend of grass. From the Neanderthals, they inherited patience, the art of waiting for the right moment in a world that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. Shelter, too, evolved. Before their arrival, the newcomers built simple huts and open camps. But in the heart of Europe's frost, they found a better design: half-buried dwellings, fortified with stone and bone, insulated with furs and branches. The Neanderthals had perfected these refuges long before, creating sanctuaries that trapped heat against the cold breath of glacial wind. To those who came from the south, these structures were revelation. They imitated them, adapted them, and passed them forward through generations that would one day forget whose knowledge it truly was. Even in art, the influence endures. Traces of ochre and manganese pigments appear in layers once belonging to the Neanderthals. The newcomers discovered how to grind minerals into powder, how to mix them with fat and ash, how to make color last even in the damp breath of the caves. What began as imitation became expression. On the walls, they painted herds, hunts, and handprints, the same motifs that had lived for millennia in the older culture of the North. For a brief moment, the Ice Age was a classroom, one species teaching another how to live, how to endure, how to belong. But beneath that exchange of wisdom, something deeper stirred. To learn from another is also to replace them, to carry their knowledge forward while leaving their name behind. The newcomers were not merely inheriting survival, they were inheriting a world. And with each season of learning, the shadow of forgetting grew longer. In the frozen heart of Europe, long before history began, survival bound species together more tightly than blood. The land was harsh, demanding unity over pride. In the valleys of the Dordogne and along the riverbanks of the Danube, traces tell a story of cooperation, of two kinds of humans whose paths intertwined beneath the same pale sky. The evidence lies scattered stone points, crafted by different hands, animal bones marked by blades of distinct design, footprints pressed side by side into the same mud. For a moment, the great struggle against nature seemed to unite rather than divide. To hunt in this age was to engage in a covenant with the land itself. The herds that roamed the tundra, bison, reindeer, mammoth, were both sustenance and challenge. They moved in patterns older than memory, and to catch them required more than strength. It required knowledge, timing, and trust. The Neanderthals had honed this balance over countless generations, learning every migration path, every gust of wind that might carry their scent. The newcomers, though clever, were inexperienced in the rhythms of the north. To survive, they learned not only from observation but from participation. They began to hunt together. Archaeologists have found signs that these hunts were not isolated events. In layers of soil near ancient river crossings, tools from both species appear in shared concentrations. Bones of game animals bear cut marks from blades of differing style, suggesting many hands worked upon the same carcass. It is here, in the mingling of effort, that we glimpse a fragile partnership born of necessity. Firelight would have flickered across faces so different yet so familiar, the silent understanding between hunters that survival was a collective act. For a time, the covenant held. The Neanderthals, seasoned masters of the chase, offered skill and experience. The newcomers contributed speed, coordination, and long-distance communication. Together, they became formidable, their combined strategies yielding more than either could have achieved alone. It was a rare balance in the story of life. Two kinds of humanity, not at war, but in concert. Yet beneath the shared triumph of the hunt, the seeds of something else began to grow. Cooperation thrives when the world is generous, but generosity in the Ice Age was fleeting. When the herds grew fewer and the snows deepened, trust strained beneath hunger's weight. The fires that once burned in unison began to drift apart, each group withdrawing to its own camp, its own circle of warmth. The covenant of the hunt had been built on survival, not kinship and survival. In the end, favors no equal. For that brief and extraordinary age, two species walked together through the wilderness, bound by cold, hunger, and the pursuit of life itself. When the trails finally diverged, the memory of that shared fire faded into silence. But the earth still remembers, in footprints pressed deep into ancient clay. The moment when both kinds of humanity hunted as one. The world began to tighten once more. The winds turned sharp, the sky dimmed, and the slow march of the ice returned to claim what warmth had briefly been won. Across Europe, the glaciers crept southward like vast, silent beasts, grinding forests into dust, sealing rivers beneath frozen armor. What had been a living world of green and movement became a realm of white and silence. The air itself seemed to harden, and with it, the hearts of those who depended on it. For a time, the alliance between the Neanderthals and the newcomers had promised hope. Together they had hunted, shared, and endured. But survival is a fragile thing, and when the earth withdraws its generosity, unity begins to crumble. The herds that once thundered across the plains began to vanish, their migrations disrupted by the advancing cold. Trees fell to frost, their roots cracking in the frozen ground. Even the rivers, lifelines of water and fish, slowed to a whisper beneath the ice. Hunger became the true ruler of the land. Archaeological layers from this period tell the story with painful clarity. The remains of camps grow smaller. Hearths become fewer. Tools more hastily made. Food bones burned to powder in desperate attempts to extract every trace of marrow. The traces of the old partnership fade. Where once two kinds of human had worked side by side, now the evidence shows isolation, one group moving south, another clinging to the last familiar valleys of the north. The ice was not just a force of nature, it was a test, stripping away everything but instinct. In this long winter, fear took root. When food is scarce, even trust begins to feel like a luxury. The newcomers, quicker to move, began to follow the retreating herds, their fires flickering farther from the ancient camps of the Neanderthals. Those left behind faced a choice without mercy: to stay and starve, or to fight for what remained. The land that had once sustained both could no longer sustain all. There are no clear signs of battles, no great massacres etched into stone, but the silence that follows tells its own story. Cooperation fades, footprints diverge, and the two fires that once burned together drift apart for the final time. The Neanderthals, bound to the only home they had ever known, faced a world that no longer remembered how to sustain them. The newcomers, unanchored and adaptive, followed the thawing edge of the world, leaving behind the keepers of the cold. As the centuries passed, the ice grew heavier, the valleys emptier, and the voices of an entire kind dimmed beneath the snow. The last winter had come, not as a storm, but as a slow forgetting, and with it, the first light of humanity's triumph cast its shadow over those it would leave behind. Across the map of ancient Europe, the traces begin to fade. The familiar signatures of Neanderthal life, their heavy flint tools, the patterns of their hearths, the bones split by practiced hands start to vanish from the soil. Caves that once echoed with their labor fall silent. The fires go out, and only the faint scent of ash lingers beneath layers of time. In their place, a different kind of presence appears. The newcomer's tools, slender and precise, begin to dominate the landscape. The change is gradual but relentless, spreading valley by valley, hill by hill. It is not the mark of catastrophe. It is the mark of replacement. Archaeologists see the shift in every excavation, in every layer of sediment that separates one age from another. Below lie the rough, familiar implements of the Neanderthal, their scrapers and hand axes, shaped by generations of tradition. Above them, finer blades emerge, longer and lighter, made by hands that saw the world differently. The two layers do not mingle for long. The transition is clean, almost deliberate, as if one story ended and another began in the same breath. At first, it might seem the work of climate alone. The Ice Age had tightened its grip once more, forcing both species into smaller pockets of survivable land. Yet the disappearance of the Neanderthals follows a pattern too precise for nature's randomness. In region after region, from the Pyrenees to the Carpathians, their settlements empty just as the newcomers arrive. It is as if the land itself were turning its allegiance. In caves along the Vézère River in France, archaeologists uncover the last signs of their craft. Thick flakes of flint, half-shaped and left unfinished, lie beside broken hammerstones. It looks as if the work had simply stopped one day. Tools laid down mid-strike, never to be taken up again. Nearby, in younger layers, the newcomer's handiwork appears: sleek blades, bone needles, ornamental beads. The contrast is haunting, the timing unmistakable. This was no single event, no sudden extinction. It was a quiet unraveling spread across centuries. One group shrinking, retreating deeper into the cold, the other expanding with the ease of those who never looked back. In the north, a few small Neanderthal enclaves seem to linger, clinging to valleys that the glaciers had not yet claimed. But even there, their presence flickers like a dying flame. The traces grow fainter until they are gone entirely. No bones tell of massacres. No burn marks tell of conquest. Yet absence, repeated across thousands of miles, speaks louder than violence. Something happened in the spaces between contact and memory. Perhaps the Neanderthals yielded ground as the newcomers claimed it. Perhaps they were pushed, not by blade or fire, but by numbers, by competition they could not match. In science, disappearance is rarely silent. It leaves patterns, echoes, anomalies in the record. Here, the silence feels intentional, almost mournful. The Neanderthals vanish not as victims of disaster, but as witnesses to a slow eclipse, one that erased their kind without erasing their traces. Every vanished camp, every empty cave is a pause in the great story of humanity, a moment where one branch of our lineage stepped aside while another advanced. And yet, the earth does not forget. Beneath our feet lie the echoes of that passing. The stone tools still lie where they were dropped. The soot still darkens the cave ceilings. To those who listen, the silence of the Neanderthals is not absence, it is testimony. It tells us that survival has never been a matter of merit alone. Sometimes, it is simply a matter of timing, of chance, of who remains when the world shifts beneath their feet. The newcomers filled the land they left behind. Their fires burned where others had burned before. Their voices echoed through valleys that once knew another language. What was once shared became inherited, and what was inherited soon became forgotten. The Neanderthals did not fall in a single night. They faded, patiently, as if making way for the next chapter of a story they could never have imagined, a story in which their absence would define everything that came after. In the layers of earth that follow the Neanderthals' disappearance, something strange begins to appear. The newcomers who once stood apart, marked by their own distinct tools and customs, begin to blur into what came before. Their craftsmanship changes. Their shapes, their symbols, their patterns of living begin to mirror those of the vanished people whose world they now occupy. It is as if the newcomers were not simply replacing another species, but inheriting one. The echoes of the Neanderthals did not vanish with their bodies, they were absorbed, remembered in gesture, in rhythm, in form. Archaeologists find this transformation written quietly into the ground. The early tools of the newcomers, thin blades and delicate points, suddenly begin to adopt the heavier, more robust qualities once unique to Neanderthals. The hearths grow larger, the shelters more anchored to stone. In the pigments smeared on cave walls, the ochres and minerals match those found in earlier layers, mixed in the same proportions, bound with the same animal fat and ash. It is as though the newcomers stepped into the abandoned rooms of the past and continued the work that had been left unfinished. This imitation is more than coincidence. In places like southwestern France and the Swabian Jura of Germany, artifacts bear the unmistakable imprint of the Neanderthal tradition. Stone scrapers shaped with identical curvature, bone awls polished by the same methods, even the arrangement of hearth circles, each detail whispers of continuity. The newcomers did not invent these things anew. They learned them from those who had lived there before. The knowledge of survival in the Ice Age was not written in language, but in repetition. The land itself became the teacher, and its lessons still carried the fingerprints of those first masters of the cold. Some archaeologists call this cultural inheritance a borrowing. Others call it absorption. But beneath the scientific terms lies a more haunting truth. The newcomers did not just take the Neanderthals' lands, they took their way of life. They slept where they had slept, cooked where they had cooked, painted where their hands once traced symbols on the rock. In doing so, they blurred the boundary between what was lost and what endured. Even in their art, the resemblance deepened. In caves like El Castillo and La Pasiega, the motifs shift in subtle ways. The early paintings of the newcomers adopt the same compositions that had once defined Neanderthal expression: abstract forms, parallel lines, dots, handprints on walls illuminated by flickering light. These are not the imitations of strangers. They are the echoes of neighbors. The newcomers were carrying forward a tradition that might have begun long before they arrived, though they may never have known whose legacy they were preserving. This silent inheritance suggests that the Neanderthals' influence did not end with their disappearance. It persisted, woven into the habits, the instincts, the rituals of those who replaced them. The newcomers may have believed they were pioneers, but they were walking paths already carved by older feet. Every hearth they built, every pigment they ground, every tool they shaped, carried a trace of memory not their own. In this, there is a paradox of survival. The Neanderthals vanished from the world. Yet, in the culture that followed, their touch remained. They were imitated not in tribute, but in necessity, because what they had created worked. The world they left behind was too perfectly adapted to be forgotten. To live in it, one had to become, in part, like them. So, the newcomers learned, borrowed, absorbed. They carried forward the knowledge of those they had outlasted, and in doing so, they unknowingly kept them alive. In every spark of flint, in every echo of painted handprint, the memory of the Neanderthals endured, not as ghosts, not as legends, but as the unseen architects of a world their successors would one day call their own. Deep beneath a limestone ridge in southern Europe lies a place that seems to hold two stories at once. It is known to archaeologists as the Cave of Mirrors, a narrow chamber where time has folded back upon itself. Inside, torches once flickered against walls, layered with symbols, some carved deep, others faint and fading, as if one hand had tried to speak over another. The rock holds a dialogue written not in words but in flame. The older markings belong to the Neanderthals, the younger to the newcomers who came after. Together, they create a haunting reflection of two worlds that touched and then tried to forget each other. The walls are darkened with soot, each burn mark deliberate, precise. Some resemble branching trees, others circles and lines that repeat like patterns of memory. When the first archaeologists brushed away the centuries of dust, they found evidence of two distinct ages of art, layered within millimeters of one another. The deeper carvings were older, weathered and smoothed by time. The lighter strokes above them glowed with newer pigment, applied perhaps a few generations later. It was as if someone had returned to a sacred place they did not fully understand, trying to claim it by rewriting what had already been said. This phenomenon is not unique to one cave. Across Europe, from France to the Balkans, similar sites have emerged where overlapping hands tell of shared landscapes and uneasy inheritance. The newcomers walked into spaces once alive with Neanderthal ritual, where firelight and echo had shaped belief for thousands of years. They built their own fires in those same hollows, their smoke mixing with the ghost of earlier flames. The evidence suggests neither destruction nor reverence, but something in between, a desire to belong in a place that had already been claimed. Archaeologists debate the meaning of this overpainting. Was it homage, an act of continuity, an acknowledgement that others had lived and dreamed there before? Or was it erasure, a quiet conquest of memory, the rewriting of sacred ground? The answer hides in the silence, between the symbols. In some sections, the newer hands followed the older lines precisely, tracing them as if learning their rhythm. In others, they cut across them entirely, replacing one vision with another. The rock, indifferent yet observant, carries both truths at once. What we see in these caves is more than art. It is evidence of identity being negotiated, tested, and transformed. The Neanderthals, with their deep familiarity of the land, had created spaces of meaning where the physical world met the spiritual. The newcomers stepped into these sanctuaries, inheriting both the awe and the authority of their predecessors. They took from them not just survival techniques, but an emotional blueprint for how to exist in a world filled with cold and wonder. Yet, in doing so, they began to overwrite the very story that had sustained them. Standing within the Cave of Mirrors today, surrounded by these layers of human touch, one cannot escape the sense of reflection. The newcomers saw themselves not as destroyers, perhaps, but as continuers, children walking through the echoes of an older humanity. Yet every line they drew over another handprint was an unspoken farewell. The Neanderthals may have disappeared, but their symbols remained, half visible beneath the surface, defiant in their endurance. The newcomers' attempt to replace them did not erase them. Instead, it immortalized their presence. The walls became a mirror not just of art, but of inheritance, of what it means to take another's place in history. In the end, the cave tells a single truth: memory cannot be completely covered. It bleeds through paint, through stone, through time itself. The newcomers may have claimed the surface, but beneath it, the Neanderthals still speak. And when the torches flicker against those ancient walls, the two lights seem to dance together once more, one fading, one rising, both eternal. In the twilight of their kind, a few Neanderthals remained, scattered across the farthest edges of the Ice Age world. They held on in pockets of warmth where the cold had not yet claimed everything. In the limestone cliffs of Gibraltar, in the mountain caves of the Caucasus, and along the lonely foothills of the Urals, small families endured as the rest of their world disappeared. These last strongholds were not the bustling camps of centuries past, but quiet sanctuaries, outposts of memory, where the echoes of a vanishing people still flickered like embers in the wind. The Earth's climate was shifting once more. The glaciers advanced and retreated in rhythms that confused the seasons, forcing migrations and reshaping landscapes. Herds of reindeer and aurochs roamed farther north, while the forests of the south became thin and patchy. The Neanderthals who stayed behind adapted as they always had, moving through the same valleys, hunting in the same ways, clinging to traditions that had carried them through countless winters. Yet now, their world was shrinking. What had once been familiar was becoming foreign. Archaeologists uncover their traces in these final refuges: tools chipped from local stone, smaller hearths built in shallow depressions, the bones of hunted animals carefully arranged as if ritual still mattered. In Gorham's cave in Gibraltar, blackened walls bear faint traces of markings, etched long before the sea rose to swallow the shore. In Mesmaiskaya cave in the Caucasus, a child's skeleton rests within layers of dust, surrounded by fragments of ochre and flint. Each discovery is a whisper from the edge of extinction, proof that even as the numbers dwindled, the will to live did not fade. These survivors would have seen distant fires glowing on the horizon, the smoke of newcomers spreading across the land. They must have known, in some unspoken way, that they were not alone and that the others were multiplying. Every trail they followed, every valley they entered, bore signs of a world being taken over. The hunters of the north were now the hunted, not by predators, but by time itself. Isolation, once a refuge, became a trap. The Neanderthals had always lived in small groups, bound by kinship and familiarity, but now their separation became irreversible. With every generation lost, their circle grew smaller. Children were fewer, elders more fragile. The songs, the lessons, the patterns of craft that once connected distant clans were breaking apart. In the silence of their caves, they carried traditions no longer shared by anyone else on Earth. To imagine these final years is to feel the loneliness of a people watching their own sunset. The last Neanderthals lived surrounded by reminders of what they had built: shelters that had once housed laughter, hearths that had once gathered many. They had survived so many changes before: ice, famine, and storm. But this change was different. This was not nature turning against them. It was inheritance passing to someone else. By the time the winds grew warmer again, the last of them were gone. No battle marked their end. No monument remembers them. They simply faded into the stone, leaving behind traces so faint that it would take tens of thousands of years for anyone to notice. Yet, in those faint remains, in the soot on cave ceilings, in the flint buried beneath the soil, the Neanderthals endure. Their story is not one of defeat, but of persistence. They stayed until the very end, holding fast to the land that had shaped them. And though the world moved on without them, the memory of their last fires still burns quietly in the bones of the earth. The story of the Neanderthals nears its quietest chapter in the faint glow of their last fires. Across the scattered remnants of their final camps, archaeologists uncover small, precise circles of ash, each one arranged with care, repeating the same pattern again and again. To the untrained eye, they are simple traces of long extinguished hearths, but to those who study them, they speak of something far deeper: persistence, memory, and the refusal to let go of meaning even as the world itself was slipping away. These were the firekeepers, the last bearers of an ancient knowledge that had once illuminated an entire continent. Fire was more than warmth to them. It was identity, the fragile line between survival and oblivion. It had carried them through the darkness for over 300,000 years, through shifting ice, through hunger and solitude. To tend a flame was to maintain a covenant with life itself. And so, even as their numbers dwindled and the cold encircled their valleys, they kept the ritual alive. In the caves of Spain and the Caucasus, excavations reveal layers of ash stacked like pages in a forgotten book. Each layer marks a return to the same spot, the same rhythm: embers, buried, rekindled, renewed. The stones that bordered their fires were not random. They were placed in deliberate formations, suggesting a pattern passed down through generations. The fire was always lit in the same way, always facing the same direction. It is as if they were holding on to a tradition long after everything else had changed. The last Neanderthals lived in a shrinking world, where the ice advanced faster than the seasons could recover. The animals they hunted grew fewer, the forests thinner, yet their camps show signs not of chaos, but of order. The hearth remained central, the circle intact. They cooked, crafted, and slept around it, bound together by its flickering light. Even when scarcity pressed hard against them, they continued to prepare their fires with care, gathering the right wood, protecting the embers beneath stone. It was not only habit, it was ceremony. Fire was their teacher, their companion, their inheritance. Around it, they told whatever stories they had left, stories that the wind would carry away but the soil would remember. It gave them continuity when the world was collapsing. To sit by the same kind of fire their ancestors had tended was to believe, however faintly, that they were still part of something larger than the cold that surrounded them. In one site, in southern Europe, archaeologists found the ashes of multiple hearths layered directly atop one another, each separated by only a few seasons. This repetition suggests a deliberate act, as if those who returned sought not new ground, but old comfort. The same hearth, reignited again and again, became a monument to endurance. The firekeepers may have known they were among the last, but they still refused to let the flame die unsupervised. There is quiet dignity in this final persistence. The Neanderthals had faced extinction not with desperation, but with ritual. Their fires were both practical and sacred, a bridge to ancestors now long gone. They tended them until their hands failed, until the smoke rose one final time into the cold air, marking the end of a lineage that had once illuminated the Ice Age world. When the newcomers walked these same lands generations later, they found blackened rings of stone, faint traces of charcoal buried beneath snow and sediment. They might have thought these fires accidental, remnants of storms or lightning. But the truth is older and heavier. These were the last signatures of a people who, even in silence, chose to remember. The firekeepers did not surrender to the cold. They carried the light until there was no one left to carry it further. And in that light, flickering against the endless night of prehistory, they left behind their final testament that to be human is to guard the flame, even when the world grows dark. The story of the Neanderthals reaches a point where the record simply stops. For thousands of years, Their presence had been written in the ground: stone tools, hearths, pigments, bones. But then, suddenly, the earth grows quiet. The rhythm of their lives, once traceable across continents, vanishes into stillness. Archaeologists call it a gap in the record, but it feels like something more: a silence, heavy with consequence, as if the world itself had paused to absorb what had just happened. For nearly 1,000 years, the layers of soil tell us nothing. No camps, no carvings, no new hearths. The steady pulse of human activity that once marked every valley and cave is gone. This is not the quiet of nature reclaiming a land. It is the quiet that follows an ending. Somewhere between the retreating glaciers and the advancing forests, an entire kind of humanity had faded away, leaving only absence to speak for them. At first, scientists thought this void might be an illusion, a result of erosion or chance. But as more sites were uncovered, the same pattern repeated across Europe, from Spain to the Black Sea. The older layers, the ones marked by Neanderthal hands, ended abruptly, and above them, nothing but sterile soil. No sign of life, no smoke, no sound. And then, much later, a new kind of presence reappeared. The fine blades, ornaments, and delicate crafts of the newcomers. Between the two worlds lay an empty space, a wound in time. What could erase a people so completely? The climate was harsh, yes, but they had survived worse. The ice had come and gone before. The animals had migrated, the forests had burned, and still the Neanderthals had endured. This silence feels different, deliberate, like the extinguishing of a flame. Perhaps it was the slow mathematics of survival, the steady imbalance between those who stayed and those who spread, between those who remembered and those who replaced. Or perhaps it was something more human, something unspoken and irreversible. Some researchers suggest disease or famine. Others imagine gradual assimilation, the last Neanderthals blending into the rising tide of newcomers until their identity dissolved. But even those theories fail to explain the weight of the stillness. It lingers too long, too clean, too total. The soil remembers conflict. It remembers fire. Yet here, there is none. Only silence, as if the last fire burned out one night and no one returned to relight it. The world during this pause must have been eerily beautiful. Forests regrew in the spaces where villages once stood. The wind moved through abandoned valleys, erasing footprints and scattering bones. The animals returned without fear. The earth was reclaiming what humanity had briefly held. The silence was not empty. It was restorative, solemn, and complete. In that long pause, the world seemed to reset itself. But beneath the stillness lies an unease. Every disappearance tells a story, even when no words remain. The Neanderthals had been more than survivors. They had been creators, caretakers, and witnesses to the first dawns of human thought. Now, nothing of them stirred. The darkness that followed was not merely the absence of life, it was the loss of memory. When the newcomers' traces finally reappeared after centuries of quiet, they entered a world cleansed of its previous inhabitants. They found caves already carved by hands like theirs, but not theirs. They built fires in hearths once tended by others, unaware of whose ashes lay beneath. The silence between these two worlds is where the betrayal hides, not in words or weapons, but in forgetting. For nearly 1,000 years, the wind carried no human song. Then, when it did again, it was a different voice. The story continued, but it was not the same story anymore. The silence had done its work. The earth had turned a page, and those who had filled the first chapters were gone, leaving behind only the quiet, waiting for someone to listen. When the story resumes, it does so with unease. After centuries of silence, the earth begins to speak again, but its voice has changed. The new layers of soil tell a different kind of story, one filled with disruption, fire, and absence. The first signs of human life returning to Europe's cold valleys appear suddenly, as if someone had moved into a house still haunted by its previous owners. Yet something is wrong. The settlements seem temporary. The fires, unevenly placed. The walls of shelters built in haste. Beneath these newer camps lie the ashes of something older, burned and buried in a way that feels neither natural nor accidental. Archaeologists call this period the reoccupation, but what they find is not simple resettlement. The newcomers, who had once appeared south of the glaciers, now spread into lands that the Neanderthals had called home for thousands of years. But the layers that separate them are thin, alarmingly thin, as though there was hardly any time between one ending and another beginning. The soil itself holds the memory of disruption. Charred hearths, scorched animal bones, fragments of tools cracked by intense heat, all signs of a sudden, consuming fire. At first glance, it looks like the aftermath of natural disaster. Perhaps the forests burned in a lightning storm. Perhaps the camps were abandoned in the chaos of famine. But nature leaves chaos behind. This destruction is patterned. The fires are deliberate, confined to living areas, repeating the same configuration across regions hundreds of miles apart. Each site tells the same story. Something was cleared away before something new began. Yet the strangest part is what's missing. There are few bones, no mass graves, no obvious signs of slaughter. The people themselves are gone, not slain but erased. It is as if an entire population had stepped out of the world quietly, leaving only their hearths to burn behind them. The newcomers' arrival follows almost immediately. Their tools appear where the ashes still smoldered. Their shelters rise on the same ground, sometimes even using the same stones that once formed Neanderthal hearth circles. They inherited the land as though someone had made room for them. The mystery deepens with every excavation. Across southern France, layers of soot overlie Neanderthal floors that show no struggle, no chaos. It is a picture of absence, not conflict. Some researchers argue that disease or starvation drove them away. Others suspect migration, that the last bands of Neanderthals retreated deeper into the mountains, taking with them whatever they could carry. Yet the pattern of fire remains unexplained. Fire is purpose. Fire is control. To burn a place before leaving is to close it, to seal its story. Was it the newcomers who set the fires, claiming territory through destruction? Or was it the Neanderthals themselves, performing a final act of farewell? Perhaps these flames were not symbols of victory, but of grief. Across cultures, fire has always been a purifier, a way to cleanse what cannot be undone. Maybe, as the cold crept closer and their numbers dwindled, the Neanderthals burned their own dwellings in ritual, acknowledging the end before it came. Whatever the truth, the result is the same. The land changed hands in silence. No battle, no witness, just a sequence of ash and renewal. When the newcomers lit their own fires atop those same ashes, they inherited a landscape already hollowed by loss. The forests grew back, the herds returned, and life continued, but something essential had vanished. In the soil, this moment is frozen like a photograph. Burned earth beneath untouched layers of human life. It marks the point where one kind of humanity gave way to another, not in conquest, but in disappearance. The Neanderthals' story ends not with defeat, but with mystery. Their homes burned, their tools abandoned, their footprints lost to time. And in their place, a new kind of fire began to glow, built upon the ashes of the old. The earth remembers both the flame that ended and the one that followed. When the cold began to loosen its grip, the world seemed to exhale. After centuries of deep frost and silence, warmth returned to the valleys. Rivers broke free from their icy prisons. Forests pushed north again, and the grasslands rippled once more with life. It was the beginning of what would later look like rebirth, a false dawn that promised renewal but carried the shadow of what had been lost. The newcomers, now spread across the lands that had once belonged to others, began to build again. Their fires burned brighter, their shelters more enduring, their tools more refined. To those who study this age, it appears as progress, but the earth remembers differently. In the archaeological record, this period is filled with signs of innovation. The newcomers shaped bone and ivory into needles, awls, and adornments. They carved antler points with intricate precision. Their dwellings, once temporary shelters of hide and branch, became sturdier, anchored by stone. Fire pits deepened, and hearths were rebuilt in deliberate circles, a design echoing those of the Neanderthals who had come before. Across Europe, the marks of a new humanity spread with speed and confidence. The world that had once been shared by two kinds of human now belonged to one. Yet beneath the surface of this prosperity lies unease. Each layer of settlement covers another's ashes. The newcomers, built atop forgotten camps, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the stories beneath their feet. Their tools and ornaments may seem superior, but they carry the ghost of imitation. The pigments they ground into color, the patterns they carved into bone, the hearthstones they arranged in perfect circles, these were not entirely their own. They were inherited fragments, learned from those whose voices had gone silent. Progress, in this sense, was not creation. It was continuation without remembrance. As the ice retreated, the land bloomed with opportunity. Herds of red deer and wild horses filled the plains, rivers teemed with fish, and the earth seemed generous again. But with abundance came separation. Communities that had once moved together in small bands began to expand, forming territories, dividing landscapes by river, forest, and ridge. For the first time, there is evidence of hierarchy, certain camps richer in tools and ornaments than others. The seeds of inequality, once unimaginable among small foraging groups, began to take root. Progress, it seems, came at a cost. The warmth of this new age also carried another deception. The fires of the newcomers burned brighter not because life had become easier, but because it demanded more. Populations grew rapidly, pushing into new lands and exhausting old ones. Hunters traveled farther for game, builders consumed more wood for fuel, and the landscape, newly freed from ice, began to bear the first marks of overuse. The illusion of abundance masked the beginning of dependence. In this false dawn, humanity stood at a crossroads. The world seemed open and generous, yet the balance that had governed life for so long was gone. The simplicity of coexistence, the reverence for the land, the intimate knowledge of its cycles, these were fading, replaced by ambition and expansion. The Neanderthals had once lived within nature's rhythm. The newcomers sought to bend it to their will. Looking back through the lens of time, this period appears radiant, an age of invention, adaptation, and resilience. But beneath its brilliance lies silence, a silence that still echoes through the soil. The last of the old fires had gone out, and their keepers were gone. What replaced them was a civilization that thrived not in harmony, but in inheritance. It was the beginning of a story that would lead far beyond survival, into the long and tangled narrative of dominance. The earth warmed, the people flourished, and history called it progress. But every dawn carries the memory of the night that came before, and in the faint glow of this new age, the world was already forgetting whose fire it had been built upon. In the heart of a glacier near the Pyrenees, where ice holds the breath of ancient winters, scientists uncovered a trail of black dust. It was not volcanic ash or the remains of forest fire, but the faintest traces of charcoal carbonized remnants of human fire, sealed in ice for tens of thousands of years. At first, it seemed ordinary, another testament to the long occupation of early humans. But as the layers were studied, the pattern revealed something extraordinary. The fires were not part of a stable settlement. They were scattered, abrupt, and fleeting. Camps appeared and disappeared as if the people who made them were not migrating towards something, but fleeing from something unseen. The charcoal fragments are tiny, yet they tell a vast story. Each speck marks a place where fire once burned, where hands gathered around warmth in the midst of cold. But unlike the steady rhythm of long-term habitation, these fires bear the signature of panic. The layers show incomplete campsites, tools half-shaped, blades discarded mid-craft, animal bones left unbutchered. The rhythm of life had been broken. Something interrupted the continuity that had defined human existence for millennia. The carbon record shows movement that defies seasonal logic. Normally, ancient peoples followed predictable routes, south in winter, north in spring, always chasing the herds, always guided by the pulse of the earth. But these fires move erratically, abandoning rich hunting grounds, skipping fertile valleys, even crossing into dangerous terrain. Archaeologists describe the evidence as one of the earliest mass dispersions recorded in the human story. But no predator, no storm, no shift in climate alone can explain the urgency captured here. This was a migration not from necessity, but from something deeper, something human. When we trace these paths, the story seems to follow the edges of memory itself. Around this same time, the last Neanderthal sites vanish completely from the fossil record. Their hearths go dark. Their tools are buried beneath newer layers of ash. And as the newcomers spread into those same regions, they leave behind signs of restlessness, of fear, as if burdened by the very ground they walked upon. The fires burn bright, then vanish. Camps multiply, then collapse. It is as if the act of settling itself had become unbearable. In the soil below the glacier, traces of ochre appear, red pigment ground, and mixed with fat, the same substance used for ceremonial marks on stone. To find it here, far from any known cave art, is strange. It suggests that ritual had been taken on the road, that people were painting not to create, but to remember or perhaps to forget. Some archaeologists interpret this as evidence of spiritual crisis, a moment when humans began to grapple with guilt, with the weight of their own survival. The glacier keeps its secrets well, but the record feels almost confessional. Each layer of charcoal, a whisper of fear. Each abandoned tool, a mark of hesitation. The newcomers, once confident in their expansion, seem suddenly haunted. They move through the land, as if chased by something they cannot name, yet something entirely their own making. The ice preserves not only their flight but their conscience. In this frozen testimony, we glimpse the emotional awakening of our species, the first time humanity may have looked backward and wondered what it had done. Perhaps they could not articulate it, perhaps they did not even understand it. But the land itself recorded their unease. They had inherited a world emptied of its other humans, and somewhere in their bones, they must have known it was not the ice that made that happen. The glacier holds more than cold, it holds witness. Each trapped bubble of air, each fleck of carbon, is a fragment of memory, the record of a people who carried warmth through the dark, but could not escape the shadows it cast. When the ice finally melts, and those fragments see light again, they tell the truth that words never could, that survival and sorrow were born in the same fire, and that somewhere beneath the snow, the earth still remembers who fled, and what they left behind. In the long silence that follows an extinction, the earth often hides its truths beneath layers of dust and time. It buries not only bones, but the choices that led to their stillness. For centuries, we told ourselves the Neanderthals were victims of nature's cold and unforgiving will. That they perished because they could not adapt, because the ice advanced and the food vanished, because evolution simply chose another path. Yet the deeper we dig, the more that story begins to fracture. Extinction, after all, is rarely the work of weather alone. Every disappearance carries with it a signature, a hand that guided it, a decision that was made. Or worse, a silence that allowed it to happen. Archaeologists once believed the Neanderthals had been outmatched, that the newcomers possessed intelligence or tools superior enough to make survival impossible for their older cousins. But the record tells a subtler, more troubling story. The two species lived side by side for thousands of years. They shared landscapes, hunted the same animals, used fire, built shelters, and even shaped tools that were indistinguishable in quality. The Neanderthals were not less human. They were simply fewer. Their communities were smaller, their children born more slowly, their lifeways bound to the rhythms of the land. The newcomers, however, carried something different, an insatiable need not just to survive, but to expand. When scarcity came, it was not the strongest who endured, but the most numerous, the most relentless. Small differences became widening chasms. The newcomers hunted more aggressively, traveled farther, consumed faster. The balance that had sustained life for millennia began to tilt. The Neanderthals retreated deeper into the forests and caves, into places where the earth's cold breath lingered longest. And still, the newcomers followed. What began as coexistence quietly became replacement. Not a war, not a massacre, but a slow and irreversible encroachment, the kind of extinction that requires no weapon, only hunger and indifference. In cave layers across Europe, traces of fire overlap like echoes. The hearths of one kind of human are buried beneath the ashes of another. The rhythm of life continues, uninterrupted, as if nothing had changed. Yet within that seamless transition lies the most haunting truth of all. The newcomers did not merely inherit the Neanderthals' world. They consumed it. Every valley, every resource, every stretch of fertile land was absorbed into a new system of survival, one that left no room for balance. For the first time in history, one human species had claimed the territory of another and did not stop. Scientists studying the pattern call it competitive exclusion, but the phrase feels too clinical, too cold. What it truly represents is the first shadow of our moral inheritance, the beginning of humanity's long relationship with dominance. The Neanderthals' disappearance was not a natural accident. It was the result of a system we would repeat endlessly throughout time. Wherever we spread, we reshaped the world to fit our needs, even when it meant erasing those who shared it. This unseen hand was not cruelty in the deliberate sense. It was something quieter, something more enduring: indifference. The newcomers did not need to hate the Neanderthals to replace them. They only needed to move forward without looking back. Every fire they built, every field they crossed, every shelter they raised, carried the unspoken assumption that their survival mattered more than anyone else's. It was not murder. It was momentum. And so, while the ice melted and the world warmed again, the Neanderthals were gone, and the newcomers stood alone, unaware that they had set a pattern that would echo across millennia. The extinction of the Neanderthals was not the end of one species, but the beginning of a behavior, a way of existing that places progress above empathy, expansion above coexistence. It was the first time we reached out to grasp the world and left fingerprints that could not be erased. The soil keeps its testimony. The bones, the tools, the ash. They tell us that the last Neanderthal did not vanish into the cold. He was surrounded by it, replaced by it, and forgotten by it. Nature played its part, yes, but nature alone does not extinguish memory. It is humanity that finishes the work, not with violence, but with silence. That silence, once begun, has followed us ever since. Across the arc of human history, encounters between different peoples have rarely been simple meetings of curiosity. More often, they carry an undertone of fear, of envy, of desire disguised as dominance. When one group perceives another as a mirror too close for comfort, conflict often follows, not always with weapons, but with the quieter instruments of assimilation, exclusion, and forgetting. In the long story of our species, this pattern repeats itself endlessly, and its first telling may have occurred not in kingdoms or empires, but in the frozen valleys of the Ice Age. When the newcomers met the Neanderthals, the world still allowed two kinds of human to walk the same earth. They looked similar, thought similarly, even used fire and tools in nearly identical ways. Yet those small differences, the lighter frame, the sharper weapons, the gift of endless adaptation, would soon become chasms. To the newcomers, the Neanderthals were not wild beasts nor mythic giants. They were something far more unsettling, a reflection of what they themselves had been, a living reminder of the fragility of their own place in nature. Ethnographers studying later human encounters can sense this same tension through time. When one culture meets another that it both envies and fears, it often seeks to control what it cannot understand. Some choose absorption, others choose erasure, but both are forms of domination. Among the records of colonial contact in more recent ages, this pattern echoes a recurring cycle of exploitation followed by silence, where one side is consumed by the narrative of the other. It is possible, even likely, that this instinct has roots much deeper than we care to admit. The archaeological record offers no direct proof of hostility between the two species. There are no battlefields, no massacres preserved in stone, but the evidence of disappearance, too precise and too consistent to be coincidence, hints at something deliberate. The newcomers may not have seen the Neanderthals as kin, but as competitors, beings who occupied the same caves, hunted the same animals, and lived within the same fragile balance of survival. The simplest way to thrive in such a world was to remove the obstacle, not by confrontation alone, but through exclusion, claiming the land, the resources, and, eventually, the very idea of what it meant to be human. The loss of the Neanderthals was not only biological, it was moral. The traces of their existence fade at the exact moment the newcomers began to flourish. One species' disappearance became another's foundation. In this transition, a subtler extinction also took place, the extinction of empathy. For hundreds of thousands of years, the Neanderthals had lived within their environment, not above it. Their lives, though harsh, were built on a quiet coexistence with the rhythms of nature. The newcomers, by contrast, began to shape the world to suit themselves. The fire that once symbolized warmth and unity became a tool for expansion and control. To call this progress is tempting, but progress without compassion is only conquest by another name. The vanishing of the Neanderthals marks the first time in our long history when kindness ceased to be a survival strategy. Cooperation, care, and understanding the very traits that had defined the success of our shared ancestors began to give way to dominance and calculation. Survival became less about harmony and more about control. It was the beginning of a mindset that would echo through ages, from ancient tribes to modern nations. When we study their disappearance, we are not only looking at a vanished species, but at the moment something within us changed. The Neanderthals remind us that humanity once had more than one voice. And perhaps, when those other voices fell silent, we lost more than diversity, we lost restraint. The ashes of their hearths still lie buried in the soil, blackened circles where stories once passed between generations. They speak of a people who endured without conquering, who survived through balance rather than ambition. The newcomers inherited the earth, but not that grace. Their triumph, as grand as it seems, came at a cost, measured not in blood, but in the quiet extinguishing of empathy. The vanishing of the Neanderthals is not only a story of extinction, it is the story of a kindness that disappeared with them, leaving in its place a species that would never again see its reflection without fear. In the quiet hills of southern France, beneath layers of limestone and centuries of dust, archaeologists uncovered a haunting scene, a floor of stone built neatly over a bed of ancient ash. The ash came from a Neanderthal hearth, its carbon particles still clinging to the memory of smoke, of meals shared, of hands warmed against the cold. Above it, the newer floor belonged to the newcomers, laid down with precision, as if marking a fresh beginning. But between the two layers, there is no chaos, no burn of violence, no sign of battle, only transition. The same space, repurposed, the same earth, claimed. It was not war that ended the Neanderthals. It was replacement, slow, deliberate, inevitable. The newcomers did not arrive with conquest in their hearts, but their very presence was enough to unmake what had come before. They built upon the ashes of another world, turning its memory into foundation. The hearth, once tended by Neanderthal hands, became the floor beneath someone else's feet. The fire had not gone out by accident. It had been extinguished to make room. To the archaeologist's eye, the evidence seems almost ordinary. The ash is faint, the stones above it unremarkable. Yet within that thin layer of soil lies the story of humanity's first quiet betrayal. The Neanderthals were not driven out by storms or starvation. They were not defeated in battle. They were simply outlasted, absorbed by a species that moved faster, multiplied quicker, and believed that the world belonged to them. It was a shift not written in blood, but in silence. The newcomers brought innovation and ambition. They created finer tools, spread farther, consumed more. But with every fire they lit, they covered another's. Their survival depended not on coexistence, but on replacement. The Neanderthals had once lived in balance with their land, their population stable, their needs bound to the rhythm of the earth. The newcomers broke that rhythm. They hunted not just to eat, but to expand. They did not adapt to the landscape. They reshaped it. The ash beneath that stone floor is more than residue. It is testimony. It speaks of lives lived in continuity, abruptly halted. When scientists examined it under magnification, they found fragments of burned bone, the remains of plants and seeds, the dust of ochre pigment once used for marking or ceremony. It was a home, not a battlefield. A place of ordinary life, erased without violence. The newcomers had not destroyed it. They had forgotten it. In this quiet forgetting lies the heart of the tragedy. The Neanderthals were not hated, hunted, or cursed. They were displaced by indifference. The newcomers did not see them as equals, nor perhaps as enemies. They saw only opportunity, shelter to occupy, land to settle, fire to rekindle for their own needs. What disappeared with the Neanderthals was not only a people, but a worldview, one that understood the earth as a partner rather than a prize. Every civilization that followed would repeat this act, often without realizing its origin. The pattern began here, in the soft soil of prehistory, where one fire turned to ash and another was built above it. It was the first time humans stood upon the remnants of their own kind and called it progress. Today, the layers still lie there, undisturbed except by the careful brushes of scientists. The black of the hearth and the gray of the stones, separated by just a breath of earth. Together, they form a quiet monument not of victory, but of succession. It reminds us that history does not always end with a cry. Sometimes it ends with a whisper, with the settling of dust over a world replaced, with the soft sigh of ash beneath a stranger's step. That thin layer beneath southern France holds the echo of that first betrayal, the moment when survival turned into inheritance, and inheritance turned into forgetting. It is a story not of cruelty, but of consequence. And beneath it all, the ash still waits, telling us that humanity's rise began not with conquest, but with the covering of a fire that once belonged to someone else. Deep within a limestone cave in southern Europe, where the light of the outside world never reaches, a pair of footprints lies preserved in the hardened mud. The first is broad and deep, the mark of a heavy frame, steady and deliberate. Beside it is another, narrower, lighter, newer. For a few steps, they move together, side by side, two shapes of humanity walking in the same direction. Then, in the layers above, the pattern changes. The broader prints vanish. Only the narrow ones continue. The cave floor becomes a page in the oldest story of loss ever written, and its silence tells us more than any weapon or wound ever could. The discovery startled those who found it. There were no bones, no remains, no sign of struggle, only the quiet record of two beings who once shared the same path. It is a haunting image, because it feels too familiar. Across time, we can almost see the scene as if through fog. Two sets of footprints, one fading, one enduring. The Neanderthal and the newcomer, walking briefly in unison before the trail divides forever. There is no violence frozen here, only absence, the space where one kind of human ends and another continues. Archaeologists have long debated the meaning of this simple pairing. Was it coincidence, an overlap of time compressed by the patience of sediment? Or was it contact, captured in a moment of fleeting coexistence? The science cannot say. But what it suggests, beyond the specifics, is that the story of extinction rarely ends with a single act. More often, it ends quietly, in gestures that leave no trace except what the earth chooses to remember. The Neanderthals were the last witnesses to a world that was once shared. They had seen the forests shift, the animals migrate, and the sky change color as the ice advanced and retreated. They had adapted to every challenge nature placed before them, but they could not adapt to being forgotten. In the final centuries of their existence, their numbers dwindled to the edge of memory. Small families remained in isolated refuges, carrying traditions and songs that would never be heard again. The newcomers filled the land behind them, building their own fires, crafting their own stories, never realizing they were stepping onto sacred ground. In the cave, the two footprints speak of that moment of passing. The broad print presses deep into the earth, as if weighed down by years of endurance. The narrower one is light, almost eager, carrying forward without pause. It is a simple image, yet it captures an entire turning point in the human story, the moment one lineage gave way to another. Not through war, but through time. When the sediment hardened and sealed those steps in place, it preserved not just their shapes, but their meaning. They are a fossil of transition, a testimony to survival and loss intertwined. The newcomers did not look back. They rarely do. And in their forward motion lay both the triumph and the tragedy of humanity's rise. Sometimes history leaves no blood, only footsteps that stop too soon. The ground beneath us carries millions of such absences, those who walked before us, whose names were never spoken, whose fires burned out in silence. Yet their presence endures in ways we do not see, in the instincts and echoes that still guide us through the dark. Standing in that cave today, where air has not moved for millennia, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what remains unsaid. The footprints are small, fragile, barely visible under the dust, but they are proof that two kinds of human once stood together, however briefly, before one disappeared forever. The Neanderthal did not vanish into myth. He walked beside us for a time, then fell behind, leaving only his imprint to tell us that we were not the first, and we will not be the last, to leave the earth wondering who might come after. There comes a moment, buried deep within the soil of prehistory, when the evidence begins to align into something far more human than chance. The Neanderthals were not overtaken by sudden catastrophe or crushed beneath an advancing glacier. Their disappearance did not come in a single night of violence or a season of hunger. It came through something quieter, more intimate, and infinitely more tragic. They were not conquered, they were trusted, and that trust became the instrument of their undoing. For years, the story of their extinction was told as one of weakness, climate change, dwindling resources, inevitable evolution. But as each excavation reveals new layers of contact, shared tools, overlapping hearths, exchanged pigments, and mirrored crafts, a different narrative emerges. The Neanderthals were not strangers to the newcomers. They were their teachers. The very techniques that allowed modern humans to survive in the frozen wilderness, the fire circles that lasted through the night, the stone-tipped spears that pierced the hides of mammoth and bison, the shelters built low and warm against the wind all bear the signature of Neanderthal innovation. Before the newcomers arrived, they were wanderers of open plains, adapted to softer climates and gentler seasons. When they entered the world of ice and silence, they would have faced conditions unlike any their ancestors had known. The Neanderthals, already masters of the cold, had endured these winters for hundreds of generations. They had learned how to track prey through snow, how to store fat from the hunt, how to read the language of smoke and wind. It was they who first painted the map of survival on this frozen continent. The newcomers must have watched them closely, at first in awe, perhaps even in gratitude. The archaeological record shows signs of shared knowledge, identical hearth designs, identical hunting traps, identical pigments used for art and ritual. For a brief time, the two species were partners in the oldest collaboration in human history. The Neanderthals opened their world, shared their secrets, and gave away what had sustained them for millennia. But alliances are fragile when scarcity grows. As the newcomers multiplied, the balance shifted. The very lessons that had ensured their survival made them stronger than those who had taught them. They expanded farther, hunted faster, claimed more. The land that had once sustained both began to yield less, and in that quiet competition, gratitude faded. The Neanderthals had made the newcomers capable, and in doing so, made themselves unnecessary. Extinction, then, was not nature's cruelty. It was reciprocity's cost, a kindness repaid with replacement. The shared fire became inheritance, then erasure. Each time the newcomers built a hearth in a cave once used by Neanderthals, they were not simply taking shelter, they were taking possession. The ashes of one kind of human became the foundation for another's rise. This is the forgotten betrayal, the moment when cooperation turned to conquest. Not through malice, but through indifference. The Neanderthals gave the newcomers the gift of survival, and in return, their memory was buried beneath the very stones they had once arranged. What vanished was not merely a species, but a way of being human that understood sharing as strength, not weakness. When we trace our lineage today, we find their traces in our bones and in our blood. A small echo of them remains within us, a genetic whisper that refuses to be silenced. Yet their true inheritance is not biological, it is moral. It asks an ancient question. What is the cost of survival when it depends on forgetting the hands that helped you endure? The Neanderthals' last gift to the world was knowledge, and their last act was trust. The world they built for two became a world for one. The fire they taught others to master still burns across our cities and our homes, but its light is haunted by the memory of those who first kept it alive. The cost of that flame was a people who believed they were sharing warmth, never realizing they were sharing their final chapter. It ends where it began, in a cave where time itself feels suspended. The last fire flickers softly, casting long, trembling shadows across the stone walls. Smoke rises in thin ribbons toward the ceiling, curling through the silence as if reaching for a sky that no longer remembers their names. Outside, the wind moves through the valley like a voice without language, brushing across the same hills where two kinds of human once walked together. This is where the story closes, not with extinction, but with remembrance. The ashes of that final fire tell more than words ever could. They whisper of a people who endured everything the earth could throw at them. The ice, the hunger, the endless night. They were not creatures of failure, as history once called them. They were architects of resilience. They learned to hold warmth against the void, to shape beauty out of survival, to care for their wounded and bury their dead with tenderness. In their world of cold and scarcity, they found meaning, not just existence. Their disappearance is not the story of weakness. It is the story of what happens when strength is mistaken for simplicity, when kindness is mistaken for fragility. As the last embers fade, the cave becomes a monument to everything they left behind. The walls are still marked by their hands, ochre prints that outlasted entire civilizations. The bones buried beneath the floor still carry the rhythm of their lives, the stress of labor, the scars of the hunt, the tenderness of care. Every trace is a testament to a people who loved, struggled, and dreamed in ways not so different from our own. They did not vanish, they were silenced. And in that silence, we learned to tell stories that forgot their names. The newcomers, who once shared their fire, built the future on the foundation the Neanderthals left behind. They carried their tools, their techniques, their understanding of the land, yet they also carried a shadow, the memory of what they had replaced. That shadow followed humanity through every age that came after, reappearing each time one people rose over another, each time knowledge was taken without acknowledgement, each time survival came at the price of empathy. The forgotten betrayal became a blueprint for civilization itself. When we look back from the height of our modern world, with its cities of light and engines of power, it is easy to believe that we were destined to triumph. But beneath every invention, beneath every monument and fire that burns tonight, lies a deeper inheritance. The bones of those who first taught us to live in balance, the echoes of those who were generous enough to share their world, even as it vanished beneath their feet. The wind moves again through the cave, stirring the last ember until it glows one final time. The light flickers against the walls, illuminating for just a moment the handprints left there tens of thousands of years ago. They seem to reach out across the ages, not accusing, but reminding. The warmth of that dying fire is the warmth we still carry. The same fire that lights our homes, our hearts, our ambitions. It burns because they once tended it, and as the ember fades into darkness, the world returns to quiet. The smoke drifts upward, mingling with the air of a planet forever changed by those who came before. In that stillness, one truth remains. We are not separate from them. We are their continuation, the living echo of their light. The wind leaves the cave, carrying with it the last breath of warmth, a single thread of memory woven through time. It travels beyond the mountains and the sea, into every corner of the world they once knew. The night deepens, and the story ends not in tragedy, but in acknowledgement. For every fire that burns tonight is a remembrance of theirs, and every human step upon this earth still walks across the bones of those who first showed us how to live.